I put my mouth, my hand, his music is a poor excuse. It's corn mixed up with lemon juice. That's 'cause this guy must play along his violin and saxophone. But if you want good harmony, takes more than one, takes two or three. Like this, like Benny Goodman, Teddy Wilson, Gene Krupa, Lionel Hampton, all teaming up to make music together as the one, the only Benny Goodman Quartet. And whenever Americans team up, there's harmony. Whenever Christian and Jew, Negro and white work side by side, they're tuned up for freedom. They're solid. Remember, folks, we can make such beautiful music together.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. For a moment, let us think back to a point in time, to October the 24th, 1957, to be precise. On that date, the President's Board of Consultants on Foreign Intelligence Activities submitted its report to President Eisenhower on the status of the intelligence community's collection capabilities. With strong urging from Dr. Edwin Land, the board called for a reassessment of the Air Force's c.i.a. satellite reconnaissance system, then under development by the Air Force. This was a complicated system based on electrical transmissions of images from space. At the same time, the A-12 Oxcart reconnaissance aircraft proposed by c.i.a. was given a careful evaluation. The board held that while both were promising programs, the critical need for intelligence at that point in time warranted an interim photo reconnaissance system that could get into operation earlier than the c.i.a. could be ready. This was a significant decision, particularly for that era. Just 20 days before, the Soviet Union had orbited the world's first satellite, Sputnik 1, from the Churatam range. The United States was still over 3 months away from launching its first small satellite. But the need for reliable intelligence on Soviet missile deployment was becoming more and more urgent. The so-called missile lag debate was already underway, with the Senate Preparedness Subcommittee holding hearings on this issue. The White House responded rapidly to the board's recommendations. Dr. James Killian, who had just assumed his new position as Special Assistant to the President for Science and Technology, arranged a meeting for the first week of December among the President, the Director of Central Intelligence, Mr. Allen Dulles, and the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Mr. Donald Quarles. At this meeting, only 8 weeks after Sputnik 1, the President decided to proceed with a joint c.i.a. Air Force interim photo reconnaissance satellite program to answer the critical intelligence questions about Soviet missiles. The system was to be based on physical recovery of film from the space vehicle. This decision marked the birth of the remarkable Corona project. The full import of the decision, however, can be comprehended only if we recall the primitive nature of our understanding of space technology and the critical need for hard intelligence information which existed at that point in time.
By the summer of 1957, the U-2 had already spent a year in service. It had never been intended as operational for more than a year or two. The operational life expectancy was based on the likelihood that the Soviets would in some months track it successfully, and with accurate tracking data in hand, bring pressures to discontinue the flights. As it turned out, we had misjudged the Soviet air surveillance capability at the time, and their radars had tracked every flight from the first. The Soviets filed a protest, and a stand-down was ordered. After that, overflights were made only sporadically, although for 3 more years, the U-2 ranged over much of the rest of the world. And so we set out on December 8, 1957, to build and develop what has become known as Corona, the world's first photographic reconnaissance satellite. Its importance from today's perspective is momentous. In the weeks after Sputnik 1, there was pressure from all quarters to accelerate the U.S. missile and space program. And there was much public debate about military versus civilian control of the space program. In the perspective of that time, President Eisenhower addressed the nation.
Long-range ballistic missiles, as they exist today, do not cancel the destructive and deterrent power of our strategic air force. The Soviet launching of Earth satellites is an achievement of the first importance, and the scientists who brought it about deserve full credit and recognition. Already, useful new facts on outer space have been produced, and more are on the way as new satellites with added instruments are launched. Earth satellites, in themselves, have no direct present effect upon the nation's security. However, there is real military significance to these launchings, as I have previously mentioned publicly. Their current military significance lies in the advanced techniques and the competence in military technology they imply. For example, the powerful propulsion equipment necessarily used.
On 8 February 1958, the President placed authority for all military space projects under the newly formed Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA. The splitting off of Corona from Weapons System 117L, the Air Force satellite program, was accomplished by ARPA just 20 days later. At about the time c.i.a.'s headquarters was being built, Project Corona was begun. It was decided at the beginning that the photographic subsystem of the Air Force's WS-117L, offering the best prospect for early success, be placed under joint c.i.a. Air Force management, an approach which had been highly successful in covertly developing and operating the U-2s. The Corona Development Project staff was formed under the direction of Richard Bissell, then Special Assistant to the Director of Central Intelligence for Plans and Development. His Air Force counterpart was Brigadier General Osmond Ripland, who had served on the U-2 development program under Bissell.
Called me in his office and gave me pretty clear instructions of what the situation was all about, because you'd done considerable homework in Washington, and from then on, maybe you better take it.
Well, I came aboard what came to be called Corona, and the manner in which I was told about it was even more informal and disorganized than that which I'd learned about the U-2 some 4 years before.
Yeah.
This time it was Din Land, and said that it had been decided at the highest level that a program would be transferred to be managed like the U-2. And he appeared in my office and said that he supposed I knew a decision had been taken to shift that program over to me, and I didn't know what program, and I didn't know what shifting it meant, and he told me it was a part of the 117L program of the Air Force, and that it was to be managed in the same way that the U-2 had been managed. But of course he couldn't answer any of my questions about who was going to pay for it, or who was doing it on the Air Force side, or what the duties of the two organizations were to be. The initial problem in this program, the cover problem and security problem, was very different from that of the U-2, because there was already quite widely known and defined from studies in your command of the Air Force an interim and preliminary satellite reconnaissance program that would not involve readout, where the emphasis would be on fairly readily available hardware and on speed, and which would run, people thought, for perhaps a year and a half, and would, as Corona eventually did, produce film in a capsule which would somehow be recovered. That was a subject to which you and I addressed ourselves on our first meeting. And as you have said, about this time, ARPA had come into existence. And it seems to me a decision had been made, again at the White House level, that the funding would not be Air Force within the Pentagon, but it would be primarily ARPA funding, with the c.i.a. funding the payload. And that, in any event, is the way it turned out for at least the first year of the program. As I look back on it, Oz, we did have one great advantage.
Corona got underway in March 1958 at a 3-day conference in San Mateo, California, among c.i.a., Air Force Ballistic Missile Division, Lockheed, General Electric, and Fairchild. The meeting brought out that while plans for a design were underway, it was far from complete. Major complications arose over basic design of the camera.
But it turned out that, in fact, there was quite a lot to be decided, because the canceled program was going to use a spin-stabilized camera designed by Fairchild, which had many advocates in the Air Force, in RAND, and in the agency. And I think the principal change that you and I made in the plans was a decision that we would go instead, which required vehicle stabilization, but would give us almost 3 times the resolution if it was successful.
Hi-Tech Corporation was a relatively new optical sciences firm formed by a group of scientists from the university research centers in the Boston area. Hi-Tech's concept proposed a longer focal length lens for the camera and scanning within an Earth-centered stabilized pod. The decision to turn to this new design was agonizing, for it meant moving from a relatively simple method of stabilization to one that was untried and technically more complicated. The advantages would be lower cost and much greater definition of intelligence targets.
A panoramic camera takes a picture by rotating a lens through an angle like this. In this model, we just took a picture through a large angle. In the original Corona camera, the lens, after taking the panoramic picture, would rotate back into position for the next picture, like this. Now, the trouble with that kind of action is that the high torques generated by the lens rotating in the 2 directions required us to put a counterbalancing mechanism in so that the action would not vibrate or shake the whole space platform. and the electrical and mechanical complexity of doing that, of counterbalancing that high torque, reduced the reliability of the early model. The second version of the camera, the so-called J version, was one in which we learned to separate the light part of the lens, the upper part of the lens near the film, from the heavy part of the lens, and we would rotate the lens across in the way the early camera did, and at the end of the picture-taking cycle, the heavy part of the lens would keep on moving. And the light part would come back, not generating much disturbance, and the heavy part would then be mechanically connected to it and synchronized, and another picture taken.
On 16 April 1958, the final project proposal, including the i.tech design, was forwarded to the President's Staff Secretary with ARPA's review and approval. The proposal was promptly approved, although never in writing, under the strict security rules surrounding the program. Work on the approved plans commenced immediately. The camera optics were optimally designed, utilizing then new computer graphic techniques. The i.tech lens was a 24-inch focal length Petzval design. Early models were f5 speed, and later ones developed to an f3.5 speed. Although a relatively conventional lens element design, these were far from ordinary. At the time the Corona lenses were made, they were equal in quality to any ever previously made. Lens blanks were taken from the finest available glasses and precision ground, checked and mounted to bring out the highest performance then known to optical science.
Do you regard black magic as being purely fictitious, or is there some truth in it?
Some truth. 100% truth. There is nothing fictitious about black magic, in any way whatever. It is a fact. It is a fact which has existed for several thousand years. I mean, when we talk about black magic, we are talking about Satanism, necromancy, alchemy, witchcraft, the worship of Satan, the worship of dark forces, whether it's voodoo, juju, whether it's something practiced in the Western world or the Eastern world, whether it's easily defined or not easily defined, the order of the left-hand path, the following of this, the following of that. It is basically the worship of the force of evil as embodied by Satan, Lucifer, the